evening, everybody. And we've got the lights set, I think. Perfect. My name is Andrew Treitz, and I'm a professor in the Institute for the Oceans and Fisheries. And it's my pleasure to welcome you to the 16th Larkin Lecture and the awarding of the first Peter A Larkin Award that recognizes a leading fisheries researcher who is committed to research excellence, inspiring education, and innovative societal engagement. And that person, as you all know, is tonight's speaker, Dr. Malin Pinsky. I want to begin tonight's proceedings by acknowledging that the land on which we gather is the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Musqueam people. I'd also like to thank all of you who have joined us online, as well as those who are here in person for being with us for this special evening. And as a reminder for those that are here, please be sure that your cell phones are muted or turned off. I met Peter Larkin for the first time in the spring of 1980 while I was an undergraduate student at McGill University. He was the Dean of Graduate Studies at UBC, and I was interested in going to grad school, but I knew nothing about the process. So I waited patiently to speak to him after his seminar at McGill. And 15 minutes later, after he explained to me how you apply, he said, "I'll take you as a student." And I've never looked back. And it was one of those chance encounters, but it speaks to his character of making time for students. Peter Larkin was a remarkable person, a mentor, researcher, and educator. And I'm very pleased to have his daughter, Jillian Larkin, here this evening to tell you more about her father and the Larkin Award. Jillian.
Thanks very much. Just out of curiosity, how many of you have been to a Larkin lecture before? Oh, so a bunch of you, okay. The slideshow going on here is hopefully giving you a little bit of an idea of who my father was. He's been gone for over 25 years now, so most of you, if not all of you except a handful, never met him. To introduce these lectures, I like to tell a little short story that adds to the picture of who he was. If you've heard this before, please indulge me. At the 1992 UBC convocation ceremony, my father received an honorary DSc and then gave a short address to the science graduates. He started out by talking about how he and my mom graduated with biology degrees from the University of Saskatchewan on a spring day in 1946, just like the students in attendance in 1992. He talked about how his head was stuffed full of the latest and greatest knowledge, and he figured he was set for life. Then a few years later, someone discovered DNA. Hadn't had any lectures on that. Then faster computers came along and new software came along. Hadn't had any courses on that. He continued with similar instances of new findings in geology and chemistry. And in his mind, all of these examples serve to demonstrate that not only were there new things coming along that they hadn't been taught, but some of the things they'd learned were just plain wrong. So he wrote to the U of S asking for a refund. Unfortunately, the university didn't agree. They came back saying they couldn't be responsible for post-graduation discoveries or something to that effect. He then went on to tell the audience that apparently UBC, unfortunately, had the same backward policy. He proceeded to address then-President David Strangway directly, asking for change. He pointed out that the scientific knowledge was expanding at an astronomical rate. The literature was doubling every 8 years at that time, and in some disciplines, like molecular biology, it was doubling every 18 months. So this meant that 90% of what would be known by the year 2000, only 8 years away, had not yet been discovered. The figures are likely even more overwhelming today. But he had a solution. He suggested that graduating students be sent forth into the world with best before labels that indicated when their education expired. And in order to be relabeled, students had to come back for refresher courses. Thus, he argued that graduation diplomas should come with detachable coupons for those refresher courses, redeemable within, say, 100 years of graduation date. All kidding aside, he then delivered his key message. He pointed out that many people in society don't have the opportunity to go to university, and many of those in university don't take science. As science graduates, that class of students was joining less than 2% of the population of Canada and far, far less than 1% of the population of the world. He maintained that it was the societal responsibility of this elite group to use their powers of analysis to weigh the evidence and speak up when others sought to fool the public, be it for fame, fortune, or political gain. He firmly believed that the most important thing provided by a university education is the thirst for more knowledge to keep you informed throughout your life. Indeed, my father was more than just a great scientist, teacher, or administrator. He was, above all, a great student. This event meant a lot to my father when it was first established and continues to be very special to our family. This award and lecture honors and celebrates my father's excellence in 3 aspects. First, he made outstanding contributions to his field through excellent science and innovative societal engagement. Second, he excelled in this medium. When my father lectured, he was energetic and engaging and witty, and he had a contagious enthusiasm for science that infected his audience. And third, he was an excellent mentor with a demonstrated eagerness to engage with students and early career scholars, as Andrew's little anecdote will attest to. So these 3 aspects, excellence in research, communication, and mentorship, form the core criteria for the selection of Larkin Award winners. We look to you, the audience, for these Larkin lectures to suggest nominees for subsequent ones. So nominations for 2025 are now open, and I invite you to reflect on who you believe embodies these attributes and encourage them to complete the nomination package. Nominations are due by November 30, and all the information about the nomination process is available on the IOF website dedicated to the Larkin Lecture and Awards. On behalf of my sisters, as well as my sisters that were in the slideshow going on there, as well as my family members who are here today, I thank you all for coming in celebration of lifelong learning. This lecture series has to date allowed 15 experts to come and share their passion with us for fishery science, and I look forward to Dr. Pinsky sharing his insights as the 16th Larkin Lecture speaker.
And thank you, Gillian. I'd like to now call upon Professor Amanda Vincent to introduce our speaker and Peter A. Larkin awardee.
Thank you. So, Malin Pinsky is a powerful example of how the very best scholars among us tend to excel at many things. So let me explain. First of all, his research is riveting and tremendously timely. Malin works to understand how climate change and climate variability drive changes in marine systems and fisheries. He has 3 main avenues of research: how social ecological dynamics of fisheries adapt to climate change, how mechanisms of rapid evolution respond to environmental change, and how to integrate climate impact forecasts into fisheries management and spatial planning, and vice versa. So yes, Malin translates new knowledge to help meet practical challenges, supporting policy and management in a variety of agencies and endeavors by fisheries management councils and NGOs tackling very critical issues. For generating and applying knowledge so effectively, Malin has earned countless awards and honors, and the list goes on forever, but they include recognition from the American Association for the Advancement of Science, the Ecological Society of America, the International Council for the Exploration of the Sea, ICES, the National Academy of Science, and so we continue. So it's very nice to add the Larkin Award to his CV among such illustrious lists. Importantly, honoring Peter Larkin's legacy, Malin excels at teaching and service. And from a teaching point of view, in reading his dossier, I'm thrilled that both Malin and I share a commitment to a flipped classroom, where as much as possible students prepare before they come in, and we can use the time together for discussion and exploration of ideas that amplifies their understanding. I'm also, and I'm sure you all share with me, I'm deeply impressed that Malin is very committed to equity, diversity, and inclusion, a centerpiece of our growing education. So, for example, he was one of the leaders on establishing a EDI committee in Rutgers graduate program. And that's kind of a concern of mine that it was so recently that it was actually established, but well done, Malin, for creating that. And also, for example, he's supervised so far 27 undergraduate students in his lab, along with a wide array of graduate students and postdoctoral fellows. And it's impressive that over half of those undergraduate students came from sectors that are underrepresented in science, giving them a chance to start forward and be the effective scholars and researchers that he's mentoring. In terms of the raw facts, Malin is currently an associate professor in the Department of Ecology and Evolutionary Biology at the University of California, Santa Cruz, where he just moved last year from Rutgers University, where he'd spent a decade. Before that, he was the David Smith Conservation Research Fellow at Princeton University, and that is a very noble award indeed, having done his PhD in biology at Stanford University with Steve Palumbi. And if you want to be inspired, have a good look at Malin's bio and CV. It is really quite wonderful. Most importantly to me in his history, Malin spent months of his PhD allied to our Project Seahorse community-based conservation project in the Philippines in 2007. And for that, and so very many other reasons, I just can't wait to hear your talk, Malin. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that very kind introduction, Amanda, to the Larkin family for the opportunity to be here, and Andrew for being my host, and to all of you for coming, and the selection committee as well for this incredible honor. It really is wonderful. You know, as I was reflecting on the talk I was going to give today, it really was, and reflecting as well on the legacy that Peter Larkin has had on our field, really was a moment of feeling very, very small and insignificant. His accomplishments across research and education and science policy and fisheries management and government administration and university administration are just incredibly impressive and also very inspirational. And I realized that I was 8 years old when Peter retired. It's been a few decades since then, and but the message, you know, many of the themes in his research and in his writing still echo very relevantly today, and to testament in many ways to how ahead of his time he was. One of those themes is in that picture right there in the middle that was in the slideshow, and this integration of mathematics and biology. And you know, in Peter's time, collecting data and putting together data sets took an incredible amount of effort and blood, sweat, and tears. And that's still true now, and yet technology has automated that process in many cases. Computers and databases are making it much more possible to put together large compilations of data collected across heterogeneous geographies. IOF and many of the research groups here have really been at the forefront of that for fisheries and the oceans. But it means that we're really awash in data, and there's a fire hose of new data coming through, and having a strong background in mathematics and statistics, along with a firm grounding in biology to understand how these systems work, is more important than ever right now. The picture there on your right, you know, for Peter's service to the university and incredible breadth of understanding, he was awarded a university professorship, professor in every faculty of the university. So crossing across disciplines and that interdisciplinarity and the ability to communicate across disciplines is more important than ever now as well. So many of the really challenging environmental problems that we face are not, you know, the solutions don't fit within any single department, and the solutions are often at those boundaries between the disciplinary training that we get. So some of those ideas have really influenced my own training, my own work, and you'll see some of those themes in my talk today. And I thought initially that, okay, maybe this is part of what the selection committee saw in my work, and I realized that no, actually it was probably something much simpler. And really captured in this figure here, this image here. And just to prove this isn't AI generated, I've got the hat right here. I hear Peter had quite a sense of humor, and apparently we both like Viking helmets for some reason. That was really fun. On a more serious theme, we do live in a fascinating but also incredibly complex and complicated time. And the ocean in particular faces a lot of challenges, many important challenges when it comes to climate change. Just to sort of start with some of the basic physics, the ocean has absorbed more than 90% of the excess heat from anthropogenic climate change. So without the ocean, we'd all be toast. We would be cooked. It's a massive heat sink for the Earth. And the ocean can absorb so much heat because, one, water has 4 times the specific heat of air. Anyone who's tried to watch a pot of water boil on your stovetop knows it takes a while. The ocean is also not small, about 1.3 sextillion liters in total. So it can absorb a lot of heat. So that also has some important consequences for how the ocean responds to climate change. So the ocean surface has only warmed actually 0.9 of a degree Celsius over the last 150 years. That's the blue line in this figure here. So it's actually less than land surface has warmed, about 1.6 degrees Celsius. So from a naive perspective, you might say that actually ocean life has been exposed to less climate change, has been less affected by climate change. And actually, historically, there has been a lot less attention to how climate change is affecting ocean life. The 4th report from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, puts out these periodic updates on climate change impacts. That 4th report gave plenty of attention to impacts of climate change on land, but almost none to impacts in the ocean. There's been a lot of work to change that over the last 15 years, but still, a lot of the attention is on what's happening on land. On the other hand, even that relatively smaller amount of warming is substantial compared to the historical variability that species in these environments have experienced. So I'm just showing you the amount of seasonal variability on the land surface there in green, so a lot, especially towards the poles. Whereas on the ocean surface, in blue, it's about 6 times less. So even a little bit of warming is a lot compared to the historical variability that a tuna or a lobster has experienced. It's also similarly when we think about space. So water has 23 times the thermal conductivity of air, so heat spreads out quickly in water. Sunlight also doesn't, and solar radiation does not penetrate well into water. So animals on land can move into the shade and move into the sun, as all of us know as well, and affect body temperature and the heat we're experiencing quite substantially. There are many fewer opportunities to hide from changing temperatures in the ocean. It's not just about temperature, though, so I do want to acknowledge that there's also this important process of deoxygenation. So it comes from both the process that warmer water holds less oxygen, but also there's less vertical mixing of oxygen into ocean water with warming. That intersects with higher metabolic demand for oxygen, especially as ectotherm body temperatures increase. Also, as carbon dioxide dissolves into water, that affects carbonate chemistry, lowers the pH, makes ocean water more acidic, and makes it more difficult for many ocean animals to build skeletons or shells. So these physics set the stage for understanding climate impacts on ocean life, but also ocean life is incredibly important for humans and human society. Marine fisheries provide the only large-scale commercial food that we get from wild populations. That's really kind of stunning to think about. Also, fish are one of the most globally traded food commodities around the world. Nearly 1 in 2 people globally rely on fish as a critically important source of protein and micronutrients. And that's not even talking about the very important cultural importance of many forms of seafood to First Nations, indigenous groups, and many other cultures. So we think a lot about impacts of people on marine ecosystems, especially coastal ecosystems. But human behavior as well also depends quite a bit on the state and the geography and the status of coastal ecosystems, whether that's fishing or recreation, other cultural pursuits. So what we have, and those feedbacks are very tight, especially in the coastal ocean. So we have people affecting marine ecosystems affecting human behavior. It becomes what we call a tightly coupled social ecological system. But that ecosystem sits upon the geography of the ocean's climate. And as the ocean's climate is changing, there are important questions about whether this tightly coupled relationship between humans and the ocean is going to roll smoothly over these waves or break apart in some way. And that's something to think about tonight and this evening, and hopefully keep thinking about in the days and weeks ahead. My talk is going to explore some of this in the rest of this hour. This isn't all, though, a talk about doom and gloom. There are actually aspects of the marine environment that also make it very resilient to impacts like climate change. Part of it is that there's quite a bit of mobility for many marine species. So, at least for me, it's a lot easier for me to run a kilometer than to try to swim a kilometer. But for a fish that has evolved in the ocean, it actually takes 8 times less energy to swim a given distance than it takes an animal on land to walk or run that distance. A lot of that has to do with the buoyancy of seawater. It also applies to very young marine animals when many of them are floating with ocean currents and can disperse large distances. So that mobility is one form of resilience for marine species. I'll talk about that a bit more later today. In addition, this image, some colleagues and I put together a few years ago to illustrate how human impacts on animals on land have really transitioned from direct hunting to now habitat transformation. And that habitat transformation on land is quite difficult to undo. Those are long-term, substantial impacts and large drivers of extinction rates on land. In the ocean, though, we're actually much farther behind. You know, large-scale commercialized whaling is a couple hundred years old. Industrial-scale fishing is sort of a mid-20th century invention. But really intensive habitat destruction still remains relatively localized for ocean ecosystems. It means that for the most part, we still have many of the building blocks to put together even ocean ecosystems that have been transformed by human activities. And I think that really is a source of hope and inspiration going forward. The challenge before us is to understand how impacts of climate change and variability filter through these systems all the way from genes to physiology and behavior to population dynamics, community changes, and interaction with human society, recognizing that climate actually acts at each of these scales, and that there are important feedbacks between these scales as well. So I think the challenge for researchers is to develop a science that can really guide effective conservation and fisheries management decisions for the ocean in this time of rapid environmental change. Given that introduction, I just wanted to give you the punchlines right here and then maybe convince you that you should agree with them as well as we go forward. So 3 things to remember from today's talk. First, marine species are in many ways more sensitive to ocean warming than species on land. Marine populations are responding in particular by rapidly shifting to new locations, and that our fisheries management and marine conservation are going to be more effective if we adapt proactively to climate impacts. And that will be, I think, the most effective way to maintain societal benefits from the coastal ocean. So I just want to start out by talking about this first point. It's useful to think in terms of what we call a thermal performance curve. So this is especially appropriate for ectotherms whose body temperature is set by their environment. Maps out how survival, reproduction, or in other words, fitness, varies across temperatures. So minimum temperature a species can tolerate and a maximum often has to do with metabolic rates, supply of oxygen, supply of food, but also protein stability and cell membrane fluidity and porosity. And we can then compare that to the body temperatures that an organism experiences. And the difference between those high body temperatures and the upper temperatures that an organism can tolerate are something that we call the thermal safety margin. It's a relatively crude but still very useful way for comparing sensitivity to warming across a wide range of species. And colleagues and I became really interested in trying to compare sensitivity to warming across marine and terrestrial species. So what we did is we compiled hundreds of experimental measurements of those upper thermal limits for both marine and terrestrial species, and then calculated body temperatures expected for those species from heat fluxes that they experience in different locations around the world, and their behavior and their ability to move into different microclimates available locally. So in this figure, less thermal safety is lower down. We've got southern hemisphere on your left, equator, northern hemisphere. And what we found is shown here, where we've got a green line for a terrestrial species, mapping out thermal safety across latitudes, the blue line mapping out average thermal safety for marine species across latitudes. This also accounts for relationships among species and some differences in experimental methods. But the key message is that across all latitudes, marine species have less thermal safety than do species on land. And it suggests that at least at the physiological scale of an individual organism, marine species are more sensitive to future warming as well. It also holds if we account for the ability of species to acclimate to ongoing changes in temperature. So that's sort of an answer at the scale of an individual organism. What if we scale up to an entire population? So we can think about a population spread across latitude or some other gradient in temperature. One of those edges of a species distribution is going to be in colder temperatures. We often call that a leading edge. Another edge in warmer conditions, we call that often a trailing edge. And as temperatures continue to warm, we might expect that that trailing edge would contract towards higher latitudes. And given what I just showed you about the sensitivity of marine species to ongoing warming, we might hypothesize that those contractions are going to be more common in marine species. The question is, are they? So, searched through 800 published papers that seemed relevant, turned up about 100 observations of trailing edges in marine species, and already half of them have contracted towards higher latitudes. Similar data for terrestrial species, it's actually only a quarter. So it does seem like that supports the hypothesis. But then, marine species move around a lot. I told you they're more mobile. Maybe it's just that they're harder to detect and they're just moving around. So we can trim this down to just species that are not very mobile. And yet, about half of those as well have contracted to higher latitudes, suggesting that actually this probably is extirpation of lower latitude populations, not just high mobility. It's not just contractions, though. So I told you there's a leading and a trailing edge. So those leading edges often at higher latitudes. And I want to show you some work that was conducted by Alexa Fredston. I was a PhD student who I collaborated with, and then later a postdoc in the Global Change Research Group that I lead, and now a faculty member leading a really fascinating group at the University of California, Santa Cruz. She was interested in comparing rates of leading edge expansion and trailing edge contraction. This is across a range of marine fishes in the northeast U.S. And actually what she found is that those leading edges are actually expanding faster than trailing edges are contracting. Suggesting that, yes, marine species are highly sensitive at that trailing edge, but many of them are more than making up for it with leading edge expansions. Important to note, though, that this can apply to all marine species. Those that are already at the poles don't have further to go. Others that also face other kinds of habitat constraints. And not all marine species are as mobile as this group of marine fishes. So this is a population scale response, though, this contraction and expansion. And it really matches some of the other results that we've been finding on the rapid shifts in marine species into new locations as temperatures change. This map, right, is a mess of arrows. Each of these colored arrows actually represents a marine taxon surveyed in a marine survey program, captured in a marine survey program, and showing how the center of their distribution has shifted over the last few decades. The black arrows show the averages within regions, and you can see there's an incredible variety. I'm sure that captures your eye quite a bit. Turns out a lot of that variation, though, is explained by the spatial mosaic of temperatures that these species experience. When temperatures warm, they're shifting into cooler locations. When temperatures cool, they're shifting into warmer locations. And that rate and direction at which temperatures are moving is something we call climate. But these kinds of large-scale observations and inferences are really made possible by an incredible global village of researchers and data scientists and ship operators and cooks and people doing quality control and quality check and running databases to make all of this possible. The map I just showed you was part of actually what's become a much larger consortium called FishGlobe. We've got the QR code right there. Some of the data from this consortium are already publicly available. I invite you to dig into it. Also welcome more contributions. Lots to do in terms of visualization and quality control and making these data more accessible. These are in particular from what are called bottom trawl surveys. So these are regular survey programs, especially on continental shelves, often conducted by government institutions or related organizations. All oceans around the world, Arctic to the Antarctic. Really an amazing record of how coastal marine ecosystems, nearshore marine ecosystems have changed over a few decades. The development of this consortium has really been spearheaded in many ways by Dr. Aurore Moreau. It was something she started actually when she was a PhD in Denmark, continued as a postdoctoral researcher. She also worked a bit in the Global Change Research Group and now is a researcher based in France. Dang Palomares is also part of our IOF, is also part of the steering committee for FishGlobe. But I did want to say that it really is a global effort to make these kinds of large-scale inference possible. One of the other things that we can do with these kinds of data sets is make simple things like animations of where marine species have been through time. This is just a few snapshots from an animation for a fishery species in the northeast U.S., showing you black sea bass on the continental shelf. We've got North Carolina down here. We've got Nova Scotia up here. And the areas in red are showing you how black sea bass shifted about 500 kilometers north over the last few decades in the northeast U.S. So these kinds of animations are actually very engaging as well for non-research audiences. It's been really actually rewarding to see how they've been picked up by movie producers, by investigative journalists, by elementary school classrooms, by a college textbook, as well as by fishery managers, especially in sort of a strategic sense about trying to think about how adaptation might play out in these ecosystems. These animations are served partly through a website we call that was developed when I was at Rutgers University. Again, there's a QR code there. Those do include Canadian data sets. But also what's been quite rewarding is actually the US federal government, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, has picked up this project and now maintains it as what they call the distribution and mapping portal. They don't yet include Canadian data, but I'm pushing them to do that as well. So this isn't just a story about individual species responding to changes in temperature, though. One of the striking findings from the last decade or so in community ecology has been that when we think about change at the scale of ecological communities, it's actually not so much a question about loss of diversity, but actually turnover and replacement of species within local assemblages. And one of the questions I was really interested in is, as temperatures change, does that change effectively the environmental filter that sets which assemblage of species can exist in a given location? So we can think about species replacement and the rate of species replacement, which differs dramatically across ecosystems around the world and across our oceans, and ask whether the rate of composition change is related to the rate of temperature change. So on the horizontal axis here, we've got faster rates of temperature change to the right, Higher up on this vertical axis are faster rates of species replacement. So these are, what I'm about to show you, results from a data set that does include bottom trawl surveys, but actually far beyond that in something called the Biotime database. About 250,000 observations of species composition spread around the world. So, a couple things. There's a lot going on in those gray dots in the background. There are so many things that affect species composition change through time. Temperature is just a tiny fraction of it. On the other hand, for assemblages exposed to near stable temperatures, we've got turnover rates around 1% per year, relatively low. Those go up about 3 times when we look at assemblages exposed to the fastest rates of temperature change. 3% per year may not sound like a whole lot, but add that across a decade and we're talking about nearly a third. So actually that is very substantial. The other thing you'll notice is that there are 2 lines here, one for warming in orange, another for cooling in blue. They both have impacts on the rate of species replacement. And in sort of climate change ecology, climate change biology, we tend to just focus on the warming side of this. But I think one of the important lessons from this is that cooling is also very important when we think about the impacts of temperature change on local ecological assemblages. And just to point out that, you know, we see these long-term warming trends at a global level, but when you zoom down to individual experience in any given location on Earth, there are many parts of the Earth's surface that are cooling for any given set of few years or maybe a decade. The map I'm showing you here is from a paper by Andy Pershing. Shows a decade of ocean temperature change in the early 2000s. And you can see in blue, many parts of the ocean surface cooled over that decade. And that's because not only is there a global warming trend, but there's substantial climate variability. We have El Nino, we have Pacific decadal oscillations, we have other forms of climate variability that are especially important at local and regional scales. So don't forget cooling. So I did only show you results so far, but actually very similar patterns hold across terrestrial and freshwater ecosystems as well. So I've also largely been talking about longer term changes in temperature, but there's also been a lot of interest in the popular press, but also in the research community in short-term, more extreme heat waves. There's the heat dome here in British Columbia. There's the warm blob in the Northeast Pacific Ocean. These large high-temperature events lasting for days or months have had very dramatic impacts on marine ecosystems. Dieback of kelp, reproductive failures in seabirds, dramatic entanglements of whales in fishing gear. Clearly, they can have very large impacts. And one of the real strengths of a data set like Fish Globe across such a wide geography is that we can start to ask whether impacts of heat waves are similar across different ecosystems. So what I'm showing you here is the cumulative intensity of a variety of marine heat waves that are captured in the Fish Globe data set. 248 marine heat waves in particular over the different geographies and decades that those surveys were conducted. Measured in degrees Celsius days, so summing the days above the 95th percentile temperatures that were typical for a given ecosystem. And what we see what I'm showing you on the vertical axis is whether biomass declined, so up to 80% lower biomass, or whether biomass increased after a heat wave. And what we see is that, yes, actually it did decline after some of these large heat waves, and that matches with what has shown up in the scientific literature. But if we look at all the heat waves, not just the ones that had a negative impact, we actually see that there's no clear common response across heat waves. Some were effectively silent and had no detectable ecological impact. Others were followed by higher biomass within some of these ecosystems. And I at least was very surprised when I saw this figure initially. So we looked at a whole range of other potential ecological responses. Is it maybe just warm water species, their relative abundance goes up, or cold water species, their relative abundance goes down? Maybe it's hard to predict the direction of change, but it's a larger change after the the shock of a marine heat wave. So maybe it's just the magnitude of change. Maybe there's faster turnover in species composition. But at least for marine continental shelf ecosystems, we don't yet know what makes a given marine heat wave impactful and other ones effectively silent. So maybe someone here in the audience or maybe someone listening online is going to discover the answer in the months and years ahead. I think it's a really fascinating but still open question. It may have to do with the coincidence of high temperature and low oxygen, high temperature, low food availability. It might have something to do with the structure of particular marine ecosystems that makes them more sensitive. We do know that kelps and corals, for example, important foundation species, are very sensitive to marine heat waves. So, I've been talking a lot about how marine ecosystems respond to temperature change, but then there's also the very important question of how do we adapt to these changes? How do we try to maintain the success of fisheries management and marine conservation in the face of rapid environmental change? So I see two components to this. One is a spatial question. Areas of the ocean do we set aside for different human uses? And then, in a time of rapid environmental change, how do we continue fishing sustainably? So on this first issue, I just want to point out that our coastal ocean is important for a wide range of different human uses, not just commercial fishing, but also recreation, cultural practices, offshore energy development becoming increasingly important. There's shipping, and many other uses even beyond that. Marine carbon dioxide removal also could be. And because of these many different uses, there's been a lot of interest in what's often sector ocean planning. So setting aside different parts of the ocean for different human uses. Showing you images from an early effort to put together an ocean plan for the coast of Vancouver Island, something I got to help out a little bit with when I was a graduate student. It was really quite an amazing experience for a grad student at the time. But mapping out different ecosystem services. But some of the uses and some of these ocean plans, offshore energy development, for example, those are uses that are going to be very difficult to move in the coming decades, if they're mobile at all. So that kind of lock-in and stasis really contrasts with the mobility of many marine species, especially in the face of ongoing climate change. It illustrates, in part, how much farther we expect marine species around the coast of North America to shift by the that red arrow for the high greenhouse gas emission scenario, blue arrow for a low emission scenario. And actually the west coast of North America has especially long arrows. And that's partly because that gradient of temperature is quite weak on the west coast of the US. You have to move a long distance to find cooler temperatures. So there's the question of, can a static ocean plan ever hope to cope with these rapid changes and the very dynamic biogeography of marine species? And even if it can, is there a really strong cost to doing so? So we approach this just as really a thought experiment. Let's think about where species are now, and given that, set aside some for fisheries where commercially important species are found, some for conservation, others for development of wind and or wave energy, and then test that against where we think species will be in the future. So when we try to do that, play that thought experiment forward for British Columbia, what we find is that the goals that we set in the beginning become fewer and fewer of them are met as we go forward, as species move out of fishing areas, move out of conservation areas. Not just British Columbia, though, it's not unique in any particular way. That applies across all around the coast of North America. So, ocean planning just developed for where species are now won't do as well in the future as species move to new locations. I will say, ocean planning is largely based around where species are now. On the other hand, there is another way we could do this. We could think not just about where species are now, but where we expect they might be in the future, recognizing that there's an incredible amount of uncertainty about where they'll be, but we do have some broad guesses. We can set up a plan that might work for both of those considerations. And what we end up with is actually a series of stepping stones, both for fishing and for conservation, with energy development zones interspersed. So as species move out of fishing zones in one area, they move into other fishing zones somewhere else, and similar for conservation. But one of the concerns is that we're effectively trying to meet twice as many planning goals, so there might be a high cost. We might have to set aside a much larger area of the ocean. Turns out, actually, we don't. That just changing the orientation of those ocean plans makes a large difference. On average, about 2% more area gets set aside. And they are more effective. So those proactive plans are shown in purple. And you can see that they are meeting more goals through time in the different zones around North America. What's also interesting is that in many cases, the benefits accrue immediately. Not only are they effective for long-term change, but they're also effective given the uncertainty about where species are likely to be in the coming decades, where the effects are more about climate variability than about anthropogenic climate change. So take-home message being that planning for species on the move can actually provide substantial benefits with relatively few costs. So then there's the question of how do we maintain sustainable fishing in a warming world? We already know that sustainable fishing is difficult. There are a lot of overfishing that is going on around the world. And on top of that, we now have ocean temperatures changing the productivity of populations. As population growth rates change, that also affects the maximum sustainable yield that these populations can produce. We often call that MSY. Now, Peter Larkin eloquently and I think very presciently skewered the concept of MSY for reasons that are just as relevant now as they were in 1977 when he wrote an epitaph for MSY. And yet, MSY has been a very sticky concept in our fisheries management. Sort of useful shorthand, I guess. This map here is showing how MSY, maximum sustainable yield, has been affected by changing temperatures for some of the largest and most important fishery populations around the world. And these are calculated in part from stock assessments for commercial fish populations around the world. And you can see in red where productivity has declined and maximum sustainable yield has declined substantially for some of these populations, but also in blue, some that have increased with changing temperatures. There are winners and losers. Overall, though, if we add across those species, there's been a decline, especially in recent decades, the capacity of these populations to produce seafood for global supply chains. On the other hand, these are changes in productivity. These are especially in fish populations that are regularly assessed in terms of how productive they are. We actually have in Canada, in the US, in Europe, and many parts of the world, this regular process of assessing the productivity of populations. We sort of have the mechanisms in place for adapting to these kinds of changes in productivity. However, in the US and Canada and Europe, we don't have effective mechanisms for adapting to changes in the geographic distribution of fish populations, at least at the level of fisheries regulations. On the other hand, fishing operations are adapting very quickly. So I just want to show you one example here. This is off the east coast of the US. This is North Carolina. So in mid-1990s, fishing trawlers from Beaufort, North Carolina were fishing right off North Carolina. In the coming 20 years, they've actually gone further and further north. They're actually traveling about 500 kilometers north up towards New Jersey. They're largely catching summer flounder, a species that has contracted substantially north in the last couple decades. Burning more diesel fuel, that's one issue. But, as you can imagine, fish don't care about political boundaries that we as humans draw across the ocean's surface. But we sure care a lot about those political boundaries. So as summer flounder has shifted across different states on the US East Coast, there have been quite some disagreements about who should get access to that fishery. Should it be the states that historically had access, or should it be the states that are more proximal to the summer flounder populations? There have been lawsuits, there's been political interference in the fishery management process, and there's even been sort of calls to undermine the ability of the fishery managers to continue managing this and putting limits on this fishery. It's not just an East Coast issue, it's also played out internationally. in some ways, fish are outrunning the laws that we've set in place. We've set in place a lot of our fisheries regulations with the idea that fish stay in one place generally through time. It's an interesting case around Northeast Atlantic mackerel that have shifted into Icelandic waters. That happened actually in the mid-2000s. Iceland, the European Union, and the other parties still haven't agreed how to share that fishery sustainably, and overfishing is continuing. It also spilled over beyond fishing and became a trade war that eventually was resolved and may have contributed to Iceland's decision not to join the European Union. So there are really important questions that go far beyond the biology about how do we incentivize cooperation for these kinds of newly transboundary fishery populations and important natural resources. This is also expected to become a much more globalized problem. This is some research I did a number of years ago with William Chung and Giuliano Palacios Abrantes and other co-authors. They're here from UBC. And all of the areas here in red are expected to have at least one new transboundary fishery by the end of this century. Again, it's not just bad news. We do actually have solutions out there that have been effective in particular geographies, including tradable permits, a solution that's been used for Pacific tuna, moratoria on fishing, like is being used right now in the Arctic, side payments, facilitated cooperation actually between the US and Canada around Pacific salmon, or also the ideas about regular updates to fishery allocations to account for changes in species distributions. Any one of these solutions is unlikely to work everywhere. One of these solutions is going to be panacea, and so there's really important work to be done to understand which solution is going to be effective in which fisheries and in which geographies and political contexts. So international agreements often take years or decades to design and implement, but they're actually across a whole range of timescales at which decisions in the ocean are made. Questions about fishing operations and shipping are often made like today or over the next couple days. We've got seasonal decisions about business operations or aquaculture operations. Fishery quotas are set and businesses plan for the coming year. It's our annual timescales. Fishery reference points and rebuilding timelines set across multiple years. Shipping lanes might get updated across sort of multi-annual timescales. And then at these long timescales, we're talking about ocean plans, conservation plans, also entry and exit decisions within operations. And part of the challenge, I think, from the research community and also from the broader communities, how do we provide climate-relevant adaptation information that aligns with the timescales of decision-making? So much of climate science right now is focused on end-of-century projections, long-term impacts of climate change on the ocean or other resources. But that's often very different from the timescales at which we're making decisions now or for the next couple of years. That urgency of what are we going to do next year, what are we going to do over the next few years, doesn't align with long-term climate change impacts. So one small step that we've been trying to take is to move away from long-term projections of where species will be to shorter-term forecasts of where species might move. It's been actually quite a challenging and fascinating intellectual exercise to not think about sort of species occurrence in the environment, but actually about the rates of demographic processes like reproduction and survival and movement, how that relates to environmental conditions. That produces what we call dynamic range models that allow us to start to predict where populations may decline and where populations may move over annual timescales. This is just one example of a dynamic range model we put together for Atlantic scallop in the Northeast US. This developed out of a collaboration with the Mid-Atlantic Fishery Management Council and hearing from them that they needed much more near-term information on where species were going to be over the coming year or few years. Still a lot of work to develop this further. But I guess my broader point is just that it's a lot more than just dynamic range models. And I think many of you online or in the audience may have the skills and inclination and motivation to start providing the kind of climate adaptation information, climate services that we need to adapt a whole range of ocean activities to the ongoing impacts of climate change and variability. So, I think our goal as a society really should be a world in which everyone, not just large, well-resourced institutions and corporations, have the information they need to adapt effectively to climate change and climate variation. And with that, just remind you, I showed you some work on how sensitive marine species are. Large-scale data syntheses across physiology and biogeography showing that marine species are moving rapidly to new locations. Work on ocean planning, suggesting that these stepping stone approaches, even though static, can actually help account for species on the move. And finally, evidence that marine fishery behavior is adapting rapidly, even if our fishing regulations are not yet. And there's underscoring the need actually for a really regular update on how our fishery regulations account for the spatial geography of where species are found, so that fisheries remain aligned with those distributions. And I guess if there are just two points to take home from today's lecture, marine species are on the front lines of climate change, and both our fisheries management and our marine conservation efforts, if they remain aligned with ongoing and future climate change. So thanks all of you for listening. I just want to thank an amazing set of collaborators for the many projects I've talked about today, the funders that make this possible, and especially the many members of the Global Change Research Group over the last many years who make this such a rewarding career to be pursuing. So thanks for listening. I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you, Malin. We have time for questions.
So Malin, that was masterful. Thank you so much. It was really enjoyable and very interesting. I warned you I might fall asleep from exhaustion, but in fact I stayed awake very long. So thank you so much. I'm going to challenge you a little bit, however.
Please.
And that is that your talk gives a sort of, thank God, hopeful idea that we might be able to adapt and respond to the pressures that are being placed on us. But when you talked about global, there was actually a marked omission of the lower latitudes in your data sets, not your fault, in the data sets, and in the evaluation of where we are on that. And so I'm a little worried the suggestion that fisheries can adapt without some significant qualifications about fisheries that are on north-south axes, fisheries that are under developed country management, fisheries that are in a very specific category. Because a large number of fisheries, we're going to get into real trouble on where there isn't that potential to adapt either. For example, in the northern Indian Ocean, how do they migrate polewards? We're going to get into a lot of trouble with that. Or when you have small scale fisheries where the mobility simply isn't there, or when the management protocols can't anticipate this. So what I'd love to see is people of your caliber moving out of this, fairly nice Western world analyses into the very serious issues where adaptation is going to be deeply problematic, and we're likely to end up with catastrophe. And how do we find the hope there?
Yeah, so point taken. A lot of the examples were definitely from the developed world. That's where a lot of my research has been, but as you know, not all of it. I also have a long-running research program in the Philippines. Not as much on fisheries though. And there's some interesting differences, as we move away from this sort of developed world focus on single species management into a much more multi-species assemblage fishery. In some ways, there's actually a lot of adaptation that's already happening just because there's turnover and also fewer constraints often on which species are caught. And even in the East Coast of the US, I showed a really dramatic example where large mobile fishing boats are moving to new locations. But even in those fisheries, many of them are small boats and they're not moving. They're actually turning over and just catching different species as the composition changes. I think what I really worry about is especially fisheries and livelihoods that are based around coral reefs. We know that corals are incredibly sensitive to warming temperatures. And so many of our, especially coastal fisheries supporting many of the most vulnerable human populations are based around coral reef fisheries. So, there's certain amount of adaptation that can happen there, but when the substrate and the structure that supports those fisheries goes away, there aren't a whole lot of other options left. And that's, I think, where I really worry. I think there important questions about coral adaptation. I mentioned that some of the work that my group does is on evolutionary adaptation that may help some corals, but really maintaining that structure of coral reefs, it's going to depend on mitigation of climate change. It's not just about adaptation.
So much more to talk to you about later.
Yeah.
Question up at the back.
Yeah.
Very much for a really interesting talk. I saw that you're doing analysis of really big data sets,
Yeah.
which is really neat. Nice to see assembly of such really big, broad data sets. But there was a lot of variability in those data sets.
Yes.
Like if you take, for example, species replacement rate with change in temperature.
Exactly.
And, so you do some sort of trend to that, and you had confidence, they're really tight, but there's so much data that the means can't be anything but well determined. But it seems like there's very poor predictive power for any one of those systems.
Yes.
And so it's good to try to understand, why is there so much variability? And could you do a better job of trying to predict that any one sort of region or area, perhaps you can use covariates or factors to find out, can we explain that variance? Has there been some thought about trying to do a better job of predicting the species replacement rates, for example?
Yeah, great question. That's something I've been thinking about a lot over the last few years, especially working with that data set. Turns out a lot of that actually is the detectability of species within assemblages. So when we're talking about those rates of species replacement are calculated from something we call a dissimilarity between consecutive or subsequent observations of species within a community. And there's an enormous amount of measurement error and observation error in those rates that has not actually been talked about a whole lot. So that's a lot of where that comes from. Yes, accounting for other covariates would help to some degree, but actually would not reduce a whole lot of that spread. It's interesting. Yeah.
And you make comparisons between terrestrial versus marine systems, and you found differences in mean time, but I can't recall what would be the explanation for the differences in I guess the response rates or change and replacement rates between those systems.
Oh, in terms of species replacement, actually, there were not strong differences between realms. And that was one of the really interesting things. I didn't mention it in the talk, but while we are seeing different rates of species movement, actually on average, species on land, there's not a detectable movement towards higher latitudes the way that it's very clearly happening in the ocean. I showed some research on thermal safety margins being thinner in marine species. But when it comes to species replacement, it's actually very similar across all realms. It's interesting that those rates are, it's very detectable.
And the variance is similar. Like there's a huge amount of
There's a lot less, many fewer data points available for freshwater ecosystems. So the confidence in those trends is quite a bit lower. Yeah.
Perhaps there's one.
Hi, thank you. That was great, very clear slides. I mean, it's beautiful. I was sitting at the back and my eyes are not as strong as they were. I could see everything. Yeah, so, Amanda mentioned in the introduction to you that you actually do some public facing work, right? The NGOs, the management system in the US and around the world. Can you talk a bit more about that? Because this group here really do care about that kind of work.
Yeah, totally. It really motivates a lot of the scientific questions that I've chosen over the years. And a lot of that actually just comes from interacting with NGOs. So I've collaborated with a group called the Coral Reef Alliance, also the Nature Conservancy, fisheries management organizations like the Mid-Atlantic Fishery Management Council in particular. And a lot of it is just listening, sort of trying to understand, what are the challenges being faced and what are the issues and how might the research that we're doing benefit the kinds of decisions that they're making. I've just, as Amanda mentioned, I've moved relatively recently to California. So one of the things I did this past year was put together a workshop with California Department of Fish and Wildlife, the Monterey Bay Marine Sanctuary, the Nature Conservancy, and a few other NGOs to understand the challenges they're facing around kelp forest ecosystem adaptation to climate change, and trying to explore where might science fit in. Especially that particular workshop was about evolutionary resilience, but how might some of the evolutionary tools that we now have available and genomic tools help some of the adaptation and restoration efforts that are going forward. And those conversations, part of it is just sit and listen, and then sort of start asking questions, and those have turned into, at least in many of these cases, really productive collaborations that have lasted many years. I find that incredibly rewarding.
Okay, question here, if you like. And then, Haley, I see we have a question online. I'm not sure if you're able to check that out.
Yeah, I had a question about this idea of fish migrating thousands of kilometers and how we can adapt the fisheries to when they move. Because I don't know if you put this into account or if maybe somebody else is looking at this, but a lot of fish, like their spawning time is regulated by photoperiodicity, right? So if they move 1,000 kilometers north, that's going to get quickly changed, and like they may be able to adapt, they might not be able to adapt. So how is that taken into account?
Yeah, so in those particular projections that I showed, they're relatively simplistic in many ways, and rough. So figuring out how behavior and spawning can or cannot adapt to photoperiod is a really important question. Yeah, so interesting work and important work to be done there. Yeah.
And while Haley's looking at a question online, I'd like to ask one. So, Malin, if I fell into a coma and woke up 50 years from now, and I now walk down to Granville Island, what sort of fishing boats am I likely to see? And would I recognize the system? What does your crystal ball tell you that we should be?
It's an impossible question.
You are thinking into the future.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, if there's anything I feel like we've learned is that there are almost certainly going to be massive ecological surprises, despite, broad trends around, okay, more southern species showing up, probably declines in northern species, especially those that are near their southern range limit in this area. So turnover in species composition, almost certainly. But also probably large changes in relative abundance of species in ways that wouldn't be able to predict just by looking at the communities that they're further south. And
Okay, we have a question online. 4% decline in MSY due to climate change, question mark. Is there other reasons behind this, like overharvesting of some species for human consumption, as well as fish meal and fish oil production? Please elaborate.
Yeah, great question. So that 4% decline, on one level sounds relatively small. On the other hand, it's a change that's already happening. This isn't some like distant future problem. And those are isolated to the temperature impacts on MSY. So there are many other things that affect fish population productivity. Overfishing being one of the most dramatic ones, and that is that 4% decline is independent from those other impacts.
Okay. I guess we'll do one last question.
It's just a quick, simple question. Your map just on the move. What was the taxonomic group that was along the Pacific West Coast?
So in general, these are all from bottom trawl surveys. So these are demersal fishes, so fishes that live near the bottom but on the continental shelf, so the part of the ocean that's relatively close to the coast. It also includes a number of invertebrates, especially crustaceans, that are well surveyed with those kinds of gears. Yeah. One of the interesting things about the U.S. West Coast, you'll see that arrow is pointing south. So over the course of this survey, it went from a very warm phase of the Pacific decadal oscillation to a cool phase. And actually, the west coast of the U.S. experienced cooling over the period of those surveys. Yeah.
Bernard? Cutting into the reception.
A map which showed the accessibility of data sets.
Yeah.
And that's a major issue for scientists who want to do research in different areas. And it's really like for graduate students and that we depend so much on being able to have access, quick access, easy access to data sets in different areas. It can be so helpful, so illuminating. And he showed a huge variation regionally. Like quite predictably, like Northeast states is like public access, Canadian like 12% once. That was like with permission and so on, but you showed a lot of black areas, and so what's behind that, and what hope or optimism do you have in trying to resolve some of those issues of like they deserve it to get it to gain accessibility to those data sets?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and actually a much longer discussion maybe to have at the reception. But there are very real concerns about data sovereignty and permission to use data sets that were collected in very different cultures, very different geographies. And in some ways, it can be very, I guess, issues around parachute science and sort of coming in and using data sets that as sort of well-resourced Western scientists or Northern scientists. So there are good reasons that many of those data sets require permission or are just not accessible at all.
Thank you, Malin. I'd like to call on Professor Chris Harley to offer a few words of thanks on our behalf.
Yeah, so momentarily, Mark McLaughlin, Dean of Science, will come up and present you with a big award. I have the honor of presenting you with a small gift of thanks. I've been a fan of your work for a long time. It's wonderful to see it put together and presented so nicely. I am a fan of your approach because you think very broadly at all these different scales, broadly geographically, while still recognizing that regional processes might be different, and that matters, and synthetically, because as an ecologist, I often forget about, the people, but you don't, and you realize that, behavior matters and rules and regulations matter. And so coming up with answers to these really important questions, I find really both stimulating and admirable. So thank you for an excellent talk. We do have a token of our appreciation. I don't know what it is, but thanks again.